Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. The US on Thursday warned China that it would face consequences for military build-up in the disputed South China Sea, where Beijing has deployed anti-ship cruise missiles and surface-to-air missile systems. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said that the Trump administration has raised the issue with the Chinese leadership. China, however, defended the deployment of anti-ship cruise missiles and surface-to-air missile systems in the disputed waters, saying it has indisputable sovereignty over the area. China is engaged in hotly contested territorial disputes in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China claims almost all of the South China Sea. Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei and Taiwan have counter-claims. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at the troubled waters of the South China Sea. Joining me on the program today are KP Nayar, Strategic Analyst, Raviprasad Narayanan, Associate Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, Abhijit Singh, Head Maritime Policy Initiative Observer Research Foundation, and Sheel Sharma, former diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Raviprasad Narayanan, I'd like to begin with you, of course. The South China Sea is one of the most contested regions in the world. What is the history of this particular region?
Frank, it goes like this. The South China Sea will remain a flashpoint because it involves irrational actors and also actors that claim to be rational in a manner of speaking. The United States is currently led by Donald Trump, who has absolutely no idea on how to run this US State Department. China, on the other hand, feels that it is at the cusp of history, where the Pacific is an open sphere of influence, where its influence is going to be number one at the expense of the United States. South China Sea is historically been a claim zone for China. And this is going to be interesting because this is also going to be a flashpoint, because we should not forget that in 2021, the Communist Party of China is going to be a century in existence. And Xi Jinping will still be at the helm of affairs. So this is going to be a hot, active zone where you can see a lot of flashpoints in the coming years.
Okay. Abhijit Singh, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. Who are the players in the region that are affected directly, and also who are the other players who want a stake in the region? And also, let's talk about, does China have indisputable sovereignty over the region as is being claimed by the Chinese?
Yeah, so first let me add something to what Ravi just said. Look, the South China Sea actually is a story of overlapping claims between 6 or 7 nations in Southeast Asia. The most important of them, of course, being China. Now, the problem isn't that the claims are overlapping, but that the Chinese have come up with something called as a 9-dash line, which almost claims 80% of the South China Sea, and that they haven't quite defined what exactly their claim is within the 9-dash line. So,
and this goes back to 1947.
This actually goes back to 1945. The first time when the map was drawn, that was by Taiwan, which was nationalist China at that point. So the Chinese have simply taken that map forward. And I would say that the immediate trigger for what the Chinese are now doing is the arbitral tribunal's ruling in 2016, which actually rejected all of China's historical claims within the 9-dash line. So the Philippines had actually taken China to court, saying that the Chinese had violated many of the provisions of the UNCLOS, and that there was no provision within the UNCLOS for something like a 9-dash line to represent any formal claim of any nation. So the arbitral tribunal very clearly said that, one, China had no historical claims within that. Now, that does not mean that China does not have territorial claims. It simply meant that the Chinese could not say that we have historical rights of fishing, or we have a historical right to do, exploit resources in these waters. The second thing that the arbitral tribunal rejected was this idea that some of these reefs could actually be converted into islands, and they could then generate territorial waters and EEZs that China was claiming. And the third thing that the arbitral tribunal very clearly said, that China was actually responsible for a certain violation in that it had actually intruded upon the Philippines' EEZs. So in all manners of speaking, China was actually put down by the 2016 arbitral tribunal. But the Chinese extremely disdainfully have rejected all of those findings. And they're now trying to assert physical control over these waters. So the Chinese are doing is two things essentially. One, they're reclaiming those reefs, converting them into islands. They're setting up military infrastructure on those islands, and that in your report suggests that they've now set up missiles, anti-ship missiles and anti-air missiles. And secondly, they are ramping up their physical presence in those waters. And only about a few weeks back, there were two massive exercises in which the Chinese sent close to 40 to 50 ships, one in which President Xi Jinping was present himself. And so the Chinese are sending out this message that in gray zone warfare, they call it salami slicing or gray zone warfare, they are the ones that have created this gray zone, and they are the ones that will control this gray zone. And there's nothing that the US or its allies or its partners can do about it.
Sure. Clearly, Mr. Nayar, the West is worried about the developments in the South China Sea. What is their game plan? What does the US have up its sleeve? What can we expect from the Trump administration?
See, the West is worried, and it's easy for the West to be worried because they are not there. They are far away, you know. So it's always a different approach when you are far away. But what matters is the countries in the neighborhood, you know. And I often get the feeling that in India, not so much in the government, but in the strategic community and in the media and in the public perception, we tend to confuse statements with actual positions, you know. I increasingly detect a gap between the statements that are made by the countries in the region, including the claimants for the disputed waters and islands, and the reality. I mean, definitely, you know, Philippines was one of the countries which was very forcefully going at it against Chinese claims and Chinese positions. But after Duterte became president, there is a definite shift, you know. Legally, there may not have been a shift. I mean, the follow-up to the tribunal's verdict and all that. The lawyers and the judges may be taking positions. But the political will is no longer there on the part of the Philippines with President Duterte there. So whatever the West wants, I think the situation has undergone a change. And as Ravi said, you know, 70% of the positions in State Department are not filled. Everybody is acting. I mean, even acting time is over. You know, South Asia, for instance, there was an acting assistant secretary. Her 1 year tenure is over. So now she has been demoted to principal deputy assistant secretary. So in a situation where you don't have a functioning State Department, what can the Americans do, you know? I mean, when I listen to Sarah Huckabee Sanders' statement, you know, I mean, consequences, what consequences? You know, in any case, we have seen consequences. Obama drew a red line on Syria. What happened? Nothing happened. And Obama was a functioning president. So with a president who is caught up in much more interesting things, to put it mildly, rather than policy or governance, I don't think the West has a game plan. And the Europeans don't have the stomach for this, or even the interest. So the West is only talking.
It's difficult to take on China, especially in their own backyard, at least looking at how the situation in the neighborhood really is what you're suggesting. Let me go across to Ambassador Sheel Sharma now. Ambassador, you know, as far as if media reports are correct, then of course this would be the first reported Chinese missile deployment in these Spratly Islands, I beg your pardon. So why is this of significance?
This is of significance because Vietnam claims Spratlys, and China is now asserting its claim on it by not only exploiting resources but also deploying military facilities. And the Chinese statement that this is all for defensive purposes, but China has every right for its sovereignty, is a very strong statement telling everyone else that this belongs to me and you lay off. Now, this Chinese assertion has been on the rise over the last decade or so. But progressively, with every passing year, their physical strength and their physical possession control has been increasing. This is part of the Chinese Go game, in which they keep putting pieces around and they control them. So even without fighting a war or even without waging a war, they gain what they set out to gain. And as has been said by previous speakers very rightly, all those other countries seem to be losing the gumption to confront China, and more so the US, which is centripetal in its foreign policy and everything else. So, and there was a statement some time back by the new Pacific commander, which said that according to which the Chinese control over the South China Sea is now completely unchallenged.
Sure.
And so the situation there is, is typically of classical imperialism, when you occupy something and control progressively increases, and then you say this is mine. So Chinese are actually, though a modern state and a modern capitalist state, but their attitudes in South China Sea they belong to previous centuries. This 9-dash line, as described very well,
Sure.
And the whole attitude. See, the way they bulldoze Philippines into accepting their claims, and the way ASEAN processes, which have been the success story of the last 40 years, even those processes have been subverted by the Chinese influence on the countries of the region, so that ASEAN cannot come to a unified position. And
Right.
China says, you deal with me bilaterally. So each of these countries have to deal with China bilaterally.
Sure, point taken.
Vietnam, which is the most, which is relatively a larger country, it is very peculiar. There is a New York Times recently published an interview of Chun Lai with James Reston of 1971, when Chun Lai was supporting Vietnam to the hilt. This was before, this was the time of the Nixon-China shift. Now, the same China today is now telling Vietnam that this, you don't have any claim on these islands.
Okay, point
both
taken.
Parcels and Spratleys.
Point taken, Ambassador.
Vietnamese
Taking
have
the
been
discussion
steadfast.
forward now. Taking the discussion forward. Raviprasad, Narayanan, what's at stake in the South China Sea?
What's at stake in the South China Sea? It is China's emerging centrality in international relations. We all know about the one road, one belt, and that is just I would say, the preamble to what is going to happen in the future. China is creating, or rather stitching together, an international system of alliances right in front of our eyes. And the domestic component, this is also to be noticed, and that is how countries like Taiwan are being entirely sidelined. When it comes to South China Sea disputes, China has a final word because it has ratified the UNCLOS, but the United States has not. So legally it is correct, it is in the right, but it feels it can create its own version of the UNCLOS once the One Belt, One Road takes off. Minus two countries, Japan and India. And as the Chinese point out very loudly, these are the only two democracies in Asia that have unresolved boundaries with all their neighbors. And this they refer to Paul Huth, who had written a book in 1996. I think it's called Standing Your Ground, where he said that two democracies in Asia have got unresolved boundaries with all their neighbors. In Japan's case, maritime; in India's case, otherwise. So China uses this opportunity to advance its own claims to international relations and to stitch together new alliances which go beyond what the US has stitched so far. And they point out the United States as being the single largest contradiction, where it has not ratified the UNCLOS. So which means that China is preparing its own version of the UNCLOS, and as one of the speakers had mentioned, one of the panelists had mentioned, yes, Rodrigo Duterte is the president of Philippines, but he has not said anything against China ever since he has come into office. Rather, he's been seeking loans from China to advance his own domestic case. And China is willing to advance that blank check to him.
Indeed.
So this is where things are heading, where Asia is going to be a different prism, where China calls the shots, decides who's going to talk, who's going to be member, etc., etc.
Sure. You know, that having been said, Abhijit Singh, you know, it's not overnight that such kind of military deployment takes place.
That's right.
Clearly, it's been happening for a while now.
That's
Why
right.
have the Americans woken up to it so late?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But before I come to that, let me just give you a maritime operations perspective. One of the issues that Ravi brought out is apt, which is that what this present crisis has done is that it has, in a sense, placed the US-China rivalry right at the center of global geopolitics. And the tragedy is that all of us now must take sides. Either you're with China or you're with the US. And if you think that you're neutral, well, then there's going to be a price to pay because both sides are not going to be really happy about it.
That's where the trouble comes for us, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, you've seen Trump making overtures towards
exactly.
India.
So
on the other hand, you've seen Prime Minister Modi visiting China. So
Absolutely. So let me just say this. So in a very tactical sense, what is the importance of the South China Sea to India? Let me just first clear this issue up. There's three reasons why I would say the South China Sea is important for India. One, a lot of our trade actually flows now from east to west. Through those important straits in Southeast Asia, almost about 50 to 60%. So we've got to be really bothered about what's happening in those important sea lanes. The second more important point is that as India has expressed its global ambitions to sit on the global high table, we need to be able to take a position on matters of international importance, on matters of maritime principle. Principally, China is wrong in doing what it is doing, and we need to take a hard stand on that. So what's happening in the South China Sea actually makes a difference for India's foreign policy. But the most important thing really is that if the Chinese have a firmer grip on the South China Sea islands, they will then be able to project more power into the Indian Ocean region. And this is a theater of direct Indian interests. For us, it makes sense if there is a greater coalition that can counter Chinese moves in the South China Sea to make sure that they're off balance in the South China Sea and they don't make their presence felt in the Indian Ocean region. If the Chinese are secure in the South China Sea, we will see more of them.
But
here.
you know that having been said, but you need a regional power as well, you know, for someone that we can support, or an arrangement like a Quad to support.
Right, an arrangement like a Quad. Look, the trouble with the Quad is that the US tends to believe that the Quad will be able to deliver on many counts. But it is clear now that the Quad is actually still an issue that is being considered by all. It's still a work in progress. So I don't think that the Quad at this point will be able to come together in a way as to offer a sort of concrete counter to China. But I think there's other things we can do. For one, what we can do is to increase our presence in the South China Sea, in the Western Pacific. We need to be sending more ships onto that side. We need to be doing more presence operations. We need to remember that that is a space that the Chinese are extremely sensitive about. And if we are there in more numbers, if we are there in more frequency, it's definitely going to sort of play into China's operational calculus.
Sure.
The last point that I wish to make, which is really important, it's very important for us to understand that the angst that we are feeling now is driven simply by the fact that the Paracels are under the de facto control of China for very long. Everyone's accepted that the Paracels are virtually Chinese territory. That was not the case with the Spratlys. The Spratlys were contested, and the Spratlys, the very few islands are actually controlled by China. Now the Chinese are building up in a major way. Now the Chinese are placing all of these anti-ship missiles, etc., the anti-aircraft guns, etc. And now the Chinese are showing that they're actually on the ascendant in the Spratlys, and that means that the Chinese will be able to control the maritime dynamic within the South China Sea.
So Mr. Nayar, are the Spratlys going the way of the Paracels?
It is difficult to say. It depends on the international international reaction.
Another question then. You know, as far as India is concerned, how concerned should we be about the developments in the South China Sea, and what are our options?
See, my personal view is that the Prime Minister's recent visit to China is an occasion to relook at what we have been saying or thinking about the South China Sea. Because you see, the previous government was rather ambivalent about it. There is no doubt, as Abhijit said, we have interests there. But you know, it is not a life or death issue for us, and we should be moderating our approach. And I think the Prime Minister's visit is an occasion to take a very realistic view about Chinese, about the South China Sea, and make sure that we don't become a trigger in any way for escalating anything in South China Sea. Because you see, other countries, in my opinion, are really not interested. You know, I mean, somebody referred to Vietnam, for example. I follow Vietnamese foreign policy very closely, and you go back and look, you know. I mean, there is talk in some quarters, especially in Washington, about how Vietnam is wanting to do defense related things with India and all that. You know, we have very good relations with Vietnam, but you look at the history of Vietnamese foreign policy. If the General Secretary of the party comes to India, the President goes to China. You know, they have a fine balance. Every time there is a visit to China, there is a visit to India, and vice versa, you know. So it is not as if the Vietnamese are going to jump on this issue because somebody says jump, and Vietnamese are not going to say how high, you know. Vietnamese have very robust and strong relations with China, and they will not do anything drastic or escalatory in South China Sea. And I think we should learn from the attitude of the ASEAN countries, you know. I mean, you know, diplomacy is always changing.
Sure.
It is never permanent or stagnant. And I think the Prime Minister's visit is an occasion for us to take a more realistic and moderate view of South China Sea, and I think that will be in line with the Prime Minister's policy initiative on China.
Sure. You know, Ambassador, several other countries too have shown concern as far as the developments in the South China Sea are concerned. You know, the Australians seem to be very concerned. Emmanuel Macron too has spoken about it. What are the options really as far as the West is concerned?
No, the point made is correct about the realistic situation today, where the balance of advantage seems to be overly in China's favor, and those who are being set up to confront it do not have the gumption or interest or wisdom, as KP Nayar describes, to confront them. But the position and our discussion is a bit neutral about government's position, because we are discussing it not in the context of what government of India is doing. The position of government of India generally has been that international law should be respected, and so in that case, you know, the sea lanes of communications and all that, they should be subject to some kind of a law. There are only two ways to deal with it. Either you go by a certain set of laws, a canon of laws, or by a concert of powers who then serve your interest. But at the present juncture, both these seem to be challenged by China. As for the concert of power, you know, there was an incident last month, or maybe earlier last month, when the Australians, 2 frigates and 1 petroleum tanker were encountered by China in the South China Sea, and they were having their naval exercises. And the statement from both sides showed the kind of reality. The Australians were saying, no, we have a right to go, and we were going to Vietnam. And the Chinese said, look, we dealt with them professionally and with due regard to safety and law.
Sure.
So they encountered the Australian ship and then dealt with them as they felt fit. So this is the kind of such situations, nobody has today in the world any interest in creating and aggravating situations like this. We have seen this even at the time of George Bush Jr. in 2001, when they had the Hainan incident. After a few days, it was resolved.
Right.
At that time, American power was unquestioned in the year 2001. So today, American power is increasingly challenged by the Chinese. Then you hear this story about today that Trump has asked to reduce the US troops in Korea, in South Korea. Trump has already been asking Japan also to pay for it and asking Korea to pay for it. Now, these kind of messages, what lessons the other draw in the South China Sea dispute? If US is going to tell this to their long-standing allies, what will the
Ambassador,
others
I'm going
do?
to take the point that you're making. I'm going to take the point that you're making to Mr. Nayar as well. Closing comments from all my guests now, because I've got limited time on the program. Mr. Nayar, respond to what the ambassador has just said, and also, is the US losing control or losing its influence over the region?
Well, first, your first question. In India, I think we should stop treating UNCLOS, the template for the laws of the seas, as a Bible for everything. People have forgotten now that when UNCLOS was being negotiated, India had very serious reservations about it, and for a long time we didn't accede to it, and we didn't ratify it, But now we are talking. I mean, no, I'm not saying the government is talking, but a lot of people who are ill-informed are treating UNCLOS as if it is the Bible, We should go back and look at history.
Sure.
And we should actually take a stop treating this as the solution for everything. But the US, I mean, it is fairly accepted now that the US position is not what it was, say, 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. There's no denying that the US is, I mean, I wouldn't like to say a declining power, but its influence is on the wane, definitely.
Sure. Okay, limited time now. Very quick closing comments from the other guests. Raviprasad, Narayanan, what can we expect in the days to come?
In the days to come, the South China Sea and Taiwan are going to be hot issues from China's point of view. Number two is that I'm expecting a total rewriting of the UNCLOS as we know it to a new kind of an UNCLOS scripted by Beijing, because I would link it up with the success or relative success of the One Belt, One Road as of now.
Sure.
And whatever China is building on the islands, earlier they were rocks, but now they are being converted into islands. It has no status under international law, under the law of the seas, but these are to me a great wall of the sea.
Sure. Okay. Abhijit, the military build-up in the islands, have they reached a point of no return?
Well, you could say that they have reached a point of no return. But the real important point from my perspective, from an Indian perspective, is that I think New Delhi's real problem is that it has a very hands-off approach to the South China Sea. We tend to think that this is a problem that affects the Southeast Asian states and the US. It has nothing to do with us. So we end up taking a very defensive position on the South China Sea. For instance, at the India-ASEAN dialogue that happened in January last year, it was very interesting that the ASEAN's focus was on maritime security. India's focus was more on maritime integration, connectivity, trade, etc., etc. Now, the message that's coming out from the US and from Southeast Asian nations, that are, many of whom are our partners, is that if you really want to play a strong role in the Indo-Pacific, as we say that we are going to play a strong role, you need to take a position on matter of security in the South China Sea, which is a critical hotspot.
Okay. Ambassador, close the show for us very quickly in 30 seconds.
Well, South China Sea is at the mouth of the Straits of Malacca on the other end. On this side, we have the Andaman and Nicobar. So we are not that far from South China Sea. And instead of looking at sweeping observations or assertions, we should look at things in their specifics and remain confined to a certain objectivity about these. This is what I feel.
Okay.
There's no need for a sweeping judgment of any kind at this juncture. We have to observe everything very carefully.
Okay, on that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.